The Second World War ended in the spring of 1945, but for months afterward, Europe felt like a place suspended between life and death. Entire cities lay in ruins, millions wandered without homes. And the world had only begun to understand the full scale of the crimes committed in the name of a totalitarian regime. Among the rubble and the broken nations, Allied soldiers continued to uncover the darkest corners of humanity, the concentration camps. Each camp liberated revealed new wounds, new graves, and new testimonies of cruelty. And then, somewhere in the quiet forests north of Berlin, the British forces discovered a place that was unlike the others, a place built specifically for women. Its name was Ravensbrück. Ravensbrück did not have the notoriety of Auschwitz or Treblinka, but the suffering inside its barbed wires was no less real. It was here that more than 130,000 women from across Europe were imprisoned, exploited, experimented upon, and, in many cases, murdered. When the gates were opened and the surviving women staggered into the sunlight, the truth they carried with them was almost unbearable. Their bodies were emaciated, their clothes reduced to rags, but their memories were sharp and terrifying. What they revealed forced the world to confront an essential question: how do you deliver justice after such unimaginable evil? The months following liberation were filled with chaos. Survivors struggled to reclaim their identities, investigators sifted through abandoned German documents, and journalists documented what remained of the buildings and crematoria. The Allied powers knew that these crimes could not be buried under the debris of war. Justice had to be visible, public, undeniable. As a result, courts were quickly established to prosecute those responsible, not just the high-ranking architects of genocide, but also the guards, overseers, and doctors who had carried out the daily machinery of brutality. Among the many cases prepared, one trial would stand out as a direct confrontation with the horrors inflicted specifically against women. The Ravensbrück Trials. Held under British jurisdiction in Hamburg between 1946 and 1948, these trials brought the camp staff, including its commandant, doctors, and female SS overseers, into the light of a courtroom. For the first time, the systematic abuse of women during wartime would be examined not as an unfortunate byproduct of conflict, but as a crime against humanity in its own right. In this video, we will retrace the path from the liberation of the camp to the courtroom steps. We will explore how investigators built their case, how survivors found the courage to testify, and how the world reacted when the truth of Ravensbrück was finally spoken aloud. The story of these trials is not just a legal chapter of post-war history, it is a moral awakening. A reminder that even after the darkest nights, justice can still rise and demand to be heard. To understand the significance of the Ravensbrück trials, we must first step back into the world of the camp itself, into the bleak, ordered landscape designed specifically to break women. Ravensbrück was not an accidental part of the Nazi system. It was a deliberate creation, built in 1939 on the shores of a quiet lake in Brandenburg. The location was peaceful, almost picturesque, chosen not for beauty but for isolation. The Nazis intended it to be a place where screams would fade into the trees, where the suffering of women could be hidden from the world. Over the next 6 years, more than 130,000 women from at least 20 different nations would be sent there. They were Jews, Poles, Russians, French resistance fighters, Dutch students, German political dissidents, Jehovah's Witnesses, Romani women, and thousands of others whose only crime was not fitting into the ideology of the regime. From the moment they arrived, heads shaved, stripped of their names, forced into thin uniforms, they were transformed from human beings into numbers on a list. Some were sent because they opposed the Nazi state, others simply because they were born into the wrong family or belonged to the wrong community. In Ravensbrück, identity meant nothing. Survival meant everything. Life inside the camp revolved around hunger, exhaustion, and fear. Daily rations were barely enough to sustain life. A piece of stale bread, a watery soup that smelled of rotting vegetables, and sometimes nothing at all. Barracks were overcrowded, often housing twice or three times the number they were designed for. Disease spread rapidly: typhus, tuberculosis, dysentery, and the camp offered almost no medical care. But it was not only starvation or sickness that claimed lives. The guards and overseers, many of them young women trained in the brutal discipline of the SS, enforced a regime of constant punishment. A misplaced step, a torn uniform, a deviation from orders, any of these could result in a beating, torture, or being added to a transport list for special treatment, a euphemism everyone quickly learned meant death. The camp also served the German war machine. Women worked in weapons factories, in workshops sewing uniforms, or in construction crews breaking rocks and building roads. Companies such as Siemens used Ravensbrück as a source of cheap, disposable labor. Workdays stretched from dawn until late evening, and those who collapsed from exhaustion were beaten until they stood again or dragged away. The brutality was systematic. It was not an accident of war, but a design. Ravensbrück was not just a prison, it was an engine of exploitation. But even within the despair of daily life, there were darker corners still. Beginning in 1942, a group of Polish women, mostly young students and resistance members, were selected for medical experiments by a team of Nazi doctors. These women, later known as the Rabbits, were subjected to deliberate mutilations, their legs cut open, bones broken, muscles infected with bacteria, and foreign objects inserted into their wounds. The purpose, according to the doctors, was to test the effectiveness of new treatments for battlefield injuries. In reality, it was torture disguised as research. Many died from the experiments, others were executed to eliminate evidence, and those who survived carried lifelong scars, physical and emotional. Such cruelty was made possible by the leadership of individuals who would later stand trial. Dorothea Benz, the feared head overseer, became infamous for her sadism, often beating women to unconsciousness and encouraging other guards to do the same. Fritz Suren, the camp commandant, oversaw the entire operation, ensuring that the machinery of death ran efficiently. Young SS women, some barely out of adolescence, were trained to treat prisoners with absolute brutality. Ravensbrück was a world where empathy was forbidden, and violence was rewarded. By the end of the war, when liberation finally came, the camp was overflowing with corpses. Thousands had died from starvation in the final months, as the Nazis abandoned their prisoners. Mass graves were discovered around the camp, and the crematorium still held the ashes of countless unnamed victims. Survivors, skeletal and trembling, told of horrors that defied imagination. And yet, despite everything, their voices would soon rise in the courtroom, demanding to be heard. To grasp the meaning of the Ravensbrück trials, one must understand that these were not trials about abstract crimes. They were the reckoning for a place built to break the bodies and spirits of women. They were the world's response to a quiet lake and a forest that had witnessed too much suffering. Without knowing the darkness of Ravensbrück, we cannot understand the weight of the justice that followed. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the world was left not only with physical ruins, but with the burden of truth waiting to be unearthed. The liberation of Ravensbrück was not a triumphant moment, but a haunting one. British forces entered a camp filled with emaciated women. abandoned documents, half-burned records, and a pervasive smell of decay. The SS had fled in the final days of the war, leaving behind a place that had been collapsing for months under starvation, disease, and violence. In the chaos of surrender, the first task of the Allies was not prosecution but survival, providing food, medicine, shelter. And yet, even in those initial moments, the seeds of the trials were already being sown, because the women who survived began to speak. Their stories were not coherent at first. Trauma fractured memories, hunger blurred details, and language barriers made communication difficult. But certain patterns appeared again and again: the beatings, the executions, the transport lists, the medical experiments, the faces of the guards, who had controlled every moment of their lives. British military investigators realized quickly that Ravensbrück was not just another concentration camp. It was a crime scene of unprecedented scale. They began collecting testimonies, interviewing survivors in makeshift offices set up in nearby towns, sometimes working by candlelight because electricity had not yet been restored. Each story added a new piece to the puzzle, forming a mosaic of cruelty that demanded legal action. Evidence gathering, however, was far from simple. The Nazis had attempted to destroy as many documents as they could before abandoning the camp. Many of the buildings were partially burned, and entire rooms of records had been reduced to ashes. Investigators had to sift through rubble, pry open locked cabinets, and search basements for anything that survived the flames. They recovered fragments of medical files, transport logs, punishment reports, and lists of prisoners selected for experiments. Even a few charred pages, once matched with survivor testimonies, became powerful evidence. The Allies understood that paper alone would not be enough. Testimony would become the backbone of the cases to come. In addition to written documentation, witnesses were crucial, but locating them was a monumental challenge. Many survivors had no idea where they were going after. Liberation. They scattered to displaced persons camps, wandering Europe in search of family or simply a place to rest. Some refused to talk at first, too devastated to relive their experiences. Others were eager, even desperate, to make sure the world knew what had happened behind the barbed wire. British investigators traveled across Germany, Poland, France, and the Netherlands to find them. They followed leads from Red Cross lists, traced hospital records, and often relied on word of mouth. She was in Ravensbrück too. She might know something. Every interview added weight to the future trial. Capturing the perpetrators posed another obstacle. Some SS personnel had fled the region entirely, using false identities or blending into refugee populations. But many were identified by the survivors themselves. Women who had been beaten, starved, and tortured now found themselves standing eye to eye with the people who once held absolute power over them. Their identification was immediate and unwavering. That one, she punished my friend until she died. I saw him oversee the executions. She selected prisoners for the experiments. These moments of recognition were chilling, but they formed the foundation of the prosecution's case. By late 1945, the British had assembled enough evidence to begin formal proceedings. They transported arrested SS women doctors and command staff to secure detention facilities. Meanwhile, legal teams prepared indictments, working tirelessly to match testimonies with documents and timelines. What unfolded over the next months was not merely a legal effort, but a moral mission. The Ravensbrück trials would be among the first attempts to hold individuals accountable for crimes committed specifically against women during wartime. The British prosecutors understood the weight of their responsibility. If the truth of Ravensbrück was not fully exposed, history itself could be rewritten. As preparations intensified, Survivors were called once again to step forward. Some traveled long distances, wearing borrowed clothes, carrying nothing but memories. They sat in small rooms with translators and officers, reliving horrors they wished to leave behind. Yet there was a sense of purpose growing among them, something that had not existed in the camp, the knowledge that their voices could finally shape the fate of those who had once controlled everything. For the first time, the women of Ravensbrück had the chance not just to survive, but to be heard. By early 1946, the groundwork was complete. The evidence was gathered, the perpetrators detained, and the prosecutors prepared. Europe was still cold from winter when the doors of the courthouse in Hamburg opened. Inside, the stage was set for a confrontation between unimaginable suffering and the fragile hope of justice. The road to the Ravensbrück trials had been long and painful, but it had led the world to a moment where truth would finally stand before the law. When the first Ravensbrück trial opened in December 1946 at the Curio House in Hamburg, the courtroom was filled with a quiet tension that words could barely capture. Journalists, military officers, and observers from several nations sat shoulder to shoulder in the wooden benches, their notebooks open, their eyes fixed on the dock where the accused were brought in. One by one. These were not the high-ranking architects of Nazi policy who had faced judgment at Nuremberg. Instead, they were the people who had carried out the daily rituals of brutality in Ravensbrück: female SS overseers, male guards, doctors, and administrative staff. Many looked shockingly ordinary, which only deepened the sense of unease. Evil, the courtroom seemed to whisper, did not always wear the face of a monster. 16 women and 6 men stood accused. Some wore prison uniforms. Others tried to maintain a stiff, military posture. In the rows behind them sat survivors, frail but upright, shaking but determined. Their presence alone was a testament to why this trial mattered. They were living evidence, breathing reminders that the crimes being described were not distant abstractions, but experiences carved into flesh and memory. The trial began with the reading of the charges: murder, torture, abuse, forced labor, participation in executions, and complicity in the medical experiments carried out on the Polish prisoners. As the charges echoed through the chamber, the accused shifted uncomfortably. Some whispered to their lawyers. Others stared straight ahead. A few maintained expressions of cold defiance, as if hoping that their previous authority might still shield them from judgment. But the courtroom did not operate on the hierarchy of the SS. Here, rank meant nothing. Only truth mattered. The prosecutors presented the structure of Ravensbrück: the roll calls that lasted hours under freezing skies, the beatings administered for the slightest infractions, the forced labor in weapons factories, the executions carried out by hanging or shooting. They described the crematorium, the gas chamber added in the final months of the war, and the transports of sick or weakened women sent to other camps to be killed. Every detail was supported by documents, photographs, and testimonies. It was as though the camp had been rebuilt inside the courtroom, not with walls and barbed wire, but with words that cut just as sharply. Then came the witnesses. Women stepped forward to speak, their voices trembling, but resolute. They identified guards who had beaten them, overseers who selected prisoners for punishment, and doctors who had stood by while their friends were mutilated. Some broke down as they recounted the deaths of sisters, mothers, and fellow prisoners. Others spoke with an emotionless clarity that was more devastating than tears. For many, this was the first time anyone had asked them to tell their full story. In Ravensbrück, silence had been a survival strategy. Here, it became a weapon against those who once demanded it. One of the most powerful testimonies came from a Polish survivor who had been part of the medical experiments. She revealed her scarred leg to the court, the bone crooked and misshapen, and described how she had been held down while surgeons cut into her flesh without anesthesia. The room fell silent as she spoke, the reality of her suffering filling the space like a heavy fog. The accused doctors sat rigidly, insisting they had followed orders, that their work had been scientific, that they had never intended to harm. But no explanation could overshadow the living proof standing before them. Defense attorneys attempted various strategies. Some argued that their clients were merely following instructions and had no choice. Others claimed the survivors had mistaken identities due to malnutrition and trauma. A few insisted that conditions in the camp had been exaggerated, but the prosecutors countered with overwhelming evidence, records, photographs, and consistent testimonies from women who had never met each other but described the same horrors. The truth, stripped of all disguise, stood firm. By January 1947, after weeks of hearings, arguments, and testimonies, the verdicts were delivered. Several of the accused were sentenced to death for their roles in systematic murder and abuse. Others received long prison terms, some life sentences. A few were acquitted due to insufficient evidence, though their reputations remained stained by the shadows of what they had done. The sentences were not met with celebration. Instead, the courtroom was filled with a somber understanding that justice, while necessary, could never undo the suffering inflicted inside Ravensbrück. The executions and imprisonments held individuals accountable, but they could not restore the women who had been lost, nor heal the wounds carried by those who survived. Still, the first Ravensbrück trial marked a turning point. For the first time, a court had recognized the unique, gendered nature of the crimes committed in a camp built specifically for women. And for the survivors, it was the moment when their pain was no longer hidden behind barbed wire. It was acknowledged by the world. When the second Ravensbrück trial began in May 1948, the world had already shifted in ways both subtle and monumental. Europe was rebuilding from ruins, alliances were forming and fracturing, and the attention of many nations had drifted toward the emerging realities of the Cold War. Yet inside another Hamburg courtroom, the past, still raw, still smoldering, was once again placed on the stand. If the first trial had revealed the architecture of cruelty in Ravensbrück, the second focused on its deeper machinery, the individuals who had operated the camp's internal systems, the doctors who had orchestrated the experiments, and the administrators whose signatures had sent countless women to their deaths. 21 defendants stood accused, including several figures who had previously evaded justice. Among them were camp doctors who had taken part in sterilization programs, overseers known for their brutality, and nurses who had assisted in lethal injections. Some had blended back into civilian life after the war, hiding behind new identities or returning to their former professions as though the camp had been nothing but an unpleasant memory to be quietly buried. Their reappearance in the dock, dragged from ordinary neighborhoods and mundane jobs, underscored once again how seamlessly cruelty had been woven into the routines of everyday people. The courtroom atmosphere carried a different weight this time. There was less shock. Ravensbrück's name was now known to the world, but there was a deeper understanding of what the trials meant. Survivors sat in the audience with a sense of weary determination. They had seen justice move slowly, imperfectly, and sometimes incompletely. Many had already testified in earlier proceedings, yet they returned because they knew that silence would mean surrender. Some arrived on crutches, some supported by daughters or friends, and some carried bundles of documents and letters that had survived the war as stubborn reminders of what had been done. Central to this trial were the sterilization experiments and forced abortions conducted on prisoners deemed unfit by Nazi Ideology. Women labeled as Roma, Jewish, Polish, or asocial had been subjected to procedures without consent, procedures that left many infertile, scarred, or dead. Doctors described their work as scientific attempts to prevent hereditary diseases, but the survivors' testimonies cut through such claims with chilling clarity. They spoke of being dragged into infirmary rooms, of waking up bleeding and disoriented, of months of infection and fever without medical care. One woman recounted how she had been told she was receiving treatment for an infection, only to discover later that her ovaries had been removed. Her voice quivered as she explained how that moment had taken not only her health, but her future, the children she would never have, the family she would never build. Prosecutors presented meticulous records, surgical notes, supply logs, rosters of women selected for experimentation. The documentation was cold and precise, yet almost every line represented a life torn apart. Nurses who had once been considered innocuous assistants now found themselves the subject of intense scrutiny. Some claimed they had been coerced. Others insisted they had not fully understood the procedures they assisted. But survivors remembered their faces, their hands, and their roles. Memory became a form of evidence, fragile yet powerful. Another focus of the trial was the camp's punitive structure, the beatings, the torture cells, the starvation punishments, and the selections for execution. Several guards had gained notoriety among prisoners for their cruelty, and now they faced questioning that exposed the details of their actions. One woman recounted how an overseer had forced her and others to stand barefoot in the snow during roll call until several collapsed unconscious. Another survivor described the shooting corridor, where guards stood at either end and executed women accused of sabotage or resistance. As the trial progressed, the defendants' strategies became clearer. Some blamed superiors, who were now dead or missing. Some insisted they had been merely clerks, simply signing whatever documents appeared on their desks. A few broke down and cried, claiming remorse. But others remained defiant, their testimonies revealing not regret but frustration at being held accountable. The judges listened, but the weight of consistent evidence and survivor testimony made the truth difficult to distort. By the time the verdicts were delivered in early 1949, it was evident that the world's tolerance for excuses had at last thinned. Several defendants were sentenced to death, others received long prison terms. A few were acquitted, but even those walked away with the knowledge that their names were now tied forever to the crimes of Ravensbrück. Unlike the spectacle of the first trial, the second concluded with a quiet gravity. There were no dramatic outbursts, no public demonstrations of anger or relief. Instead, there was a collective exhale, an acknowledgement that another layer of truth had been forced into the light. For the survivors, the verdicts were a mixture of closure and incompleteness. Justice had been served, but the cost of achieving it had been immense. Many returned to fragile lives in countries still recovering from war, carrying wounds that no court decision could heal. Yet the second Ravensbrück trial ensured that their suffering would not vanish into the haze of post-war politics. It reaffirmed, at a time when the world was already eager to look forward, that the past could not be dismissed simply because it made people uncomfortable. The trial stood as a testament not only to the cruelty inflicted within the camp's walls, but to the resilience of those who survived. Their persistence, their determination to speak even when their voices trembled, transformed the courtroom into a place where justice, however delayed, however imperfect, could finally take root. And in doing so, they ensured that the story of Ravensbrück would not be told from the perspective of its perpetrators, but through the voices of the women who had endured, resisted, and ultimately outlasted those who tried to destroy them. In the years that followed the Ravensbrück trials, the echoes of the courtroom lingered far beyond the walls of Hamburg. Justice had been served in a legal sense, but the deeper work, the moral reckoning, the rebuilding of shattered lives, the transmission of memory, was only beginning. For most survivors, leaving the courtroom did not mean leaving the past behind. They returned to countries scarred by war, to families that often no longer existed, to futures that felt both fragile and unfamiliar. And yet, despite everything they had endured, many began to speak, to write, to educate, and to ensure that Ravensbrück would not become a forgotten footnote among the atrocities of the Second World War. One of the most profound legacies of the trials was the recognition of women suffering in a conflict often narrated through the experiences of men. Ravensbrück was the only major Nazi concentration camp built specifically for women, and the testimony brought forward during the trials forced the world to confront a dimension of the Holocaust and Nazi brutality that had been largely overlooked. The stories of forced labor, sterilization, medical experiments, torture, and sexualized violence challenged long-held assumptions about women's roles in war. Survivors made it clear that they were not simply collateral victims. They had been targets of a systematic, gendered campaign of oppression. Their voices carved out a space in historical memory that had previously been denied to them. In many European countries, Ravensbrück survivors helped shape public understanding of the war. Polish, French, Czech, German, and Scandinavian women formed associations, wrote memoirs, and visited schools to tell the next generation what had happened behind the barbed wires. Some became activists fighting for human rights and gender equality, driven by the conviction that the world had to learn from what they had endured. Others struggled in silence, unable to revisit the terror that had marked every day of their imprisonment. But even their silence carried meaning, reminding society that trauma leaves shadows far longer than any legal judgment can reach. For the families of survivors, and for the children of those who never returned, the trials offered a small measure of closure. The punishments handed down to the perpetrators created a historical record that could not be denied. It ensured that their loved ones' suffering had been acknowledged by the world. Yet many relatives felt the incompleteness of justice keenly. How could a sentence, whether a few years or even death, ever compensate for the loss of a mother, sister, daughter, or friend? The answer was that it could not. But it did affirm something essential, that the crimes committed at Ravensbrück were real, were criminal, and were condemned by the world. Meanwhile, memory itself became a battleground. As Europe entered the Cold War, narratives about the victims and perpetrators fractured along political lines. Some countries emphasized the suffering of political prisoners. Others highlighted the destruction of Jewish communities. Still others focused on national martyrs. The full diversity of Ravensbrück's prisoners, Jews, Roma, resistance fighters, lesbians, Jehovah's Witnesses, so-called asocial, women, and ordinary citizens caught in brutal sweeps, was often simplified or distorted. It would take decades of scholarship, survivor activism, and international cooperation to reconstruct the truth in all its painful complexity. The physical site of Ravensbrück also underwent a transformation. In the immediate post-war years, the camp was used by Soviet forces, and parts of it were demolished or repurposed. But as survivors pushed for recognition, memorial efforts slowly took shape. Today, the camp stands as a solemn reminder of what happened there. The watchtower still overlooking the lake, the remains of barracks marked by stone outlines, the crematorium preserved as a warning to future generations. Exhibits feature personal belongings, letters, children's drawings, handcrafted objects secretly made by prisoners that testify not just to suffering, but to resilience, creativity, and the will to survive. One of the most powerful legacies of Ravensbrück lies in the way survivors supported one another after the war. For many, the friendships formed in the camp became lifelong bonds, sources of strength in moments when the world felt indifferent or hostile to their experiences. Reunions held decades later were not merely nostalgic gatherings. They were acts of defiance against the forces that had tried to destroy them. Women who had once stood together in cold roll call squares now embraced as grandmothers, scholars, writers, and community leaders. Their survival was itself a victory. The Ravensbrück Trials also influenced international law. They contributed to the development of the legal concept of crimes against humanity, articulated the responsibility of individuals, regardless of rank, for participating in systemic atrocity, and highlighted the unique vulnerabilities faced by women during war. These precedents would echo through later tribunals, from the Balkans to Rwanda, shaping how the world responds to mass violence. As the decades passed, and the number of living survivors dwindled, their stories gained an even deeper urgency. Museums, documentaries, and educational programs sought to preserve their testimonies before they were lost forever. Younger generations took on the responsibility of remembrance, understanding that memory is not inherited automatically. It must be carried forward deliberately, conscientiously, and with empathy. In the end, the legacy of Ravensbrück is not defined solely by the cruelty that occurred there, nor even by the trials that sought to bring justice. It is defined by the women who refused to let the truth disappear. They rebuilt their lives from ruins, carried their trauma with dignity, and insisted that the world listen. Their voices continue to resonate today, reminding us that even in the darkest chapters of history, humanity's capacity for courage and solidarity can endure. And as long as their stories are told, Ravensbrück will not fade into silence. It will stand as a warning, a memory, and a testament to the strength of those who survived. As we reach the end of this story, we return to the question that has hovered over every courtroom testimony, every fragment of memory, and every silent photograph of Ravensbrück. What does justice truly mean after such profound suffering? The trials held in the years after 1945 were imperfect, incomplete, and often constrained by the politics of a world rushing into its next era. Yet they represented something vital, a declaration that crimes committed against women in the darkness of war would not remain hidden in that darkness forever. They showed that even when the world is fractured, even when truth is painful, it must still be spoken. The survivors of Ravensbrück carried their experiences with them long after the judges laid down their gavels. For some, justice meant seeing the perpetrators punished. For others, it meant being able to tell their story without fear of being dismissed or forgotten. And for many, justice was simply the ability to build a life again, to create families, careers, friendships, and futures that the camp had tried to steal from them. Their lives after the war were acts of quiet rebellion against a system that had once declared them worthless. By surviving, by loving, by teaching, by writing, they proved that the cruelty of the camp had not succeeded in defining them. Ravensbrück itself, its barracks, its watchtowers, its crematorium, has become less a place of death and more a living archive of memory. Visitors who walk through its grounds today do so with the awareness that they are treading on soil where countless women once stood, suffered, resisted, and dreamed of freedom. The silence of the camp is heavy, but it is no longer the silence of fear. It is the silence of remembrance, a pause that demands reflection and responsibility. It asks each of us to carry forward the stories of the women who lived and died there, not as distant figures of history, but as human beings whose lives were forever altered by hatred and tyranny. The legacy of the Ravensbrück Trials stretches far beyond the post-war years. It reaches into our present, reminding us of the importance of documenting truth, of listening to marginalized voices, and of confronting cruelty even when it is politically inconvenient or emotionally overwhelming. The trials set legal precedents that have shaped how the world understands war, crimes, and crimes against humanity. They established that gendered violence is not an accident of conflict but a weapon, and one that must be prosecuted with the same seriousness as any other atrocity. Most importantly, they ensured that the suffering of the women of Ravensbrück would not disappear into obscurity. But perhaps the deepest legacy lies in what these women taught us about resilience. They endured a world built to break them, yet they found ways to care for one another, to resist, to hold on to fragments of hope. In the courtroom, they faced their tormentors not with vengeance, but with clarity. Their testimonies were acts of courage, affirmations that truth matters even when it hurts. And in the years that followed, they transformed their pain into warnings for future generations. As we reflect on their stories, we are reminded that justice is not a single moment, it is an ongoing commitment. It is the work of remembering, of learning, of recognizing patterns of hatred before they escalate into violence. It is the responsibility to protect the vulnerable, to challenge systems of oppression, and to ensure that "never again" is more than a phrase. Carved into stone, the women of Ravensbrück did their part. They carried their truth into a world that was not always ready to hear it, and in doing so, they changed the course of history. Now it falls to us to carry their memory forward, to tell their stories, to honor their courage, to ensure that the lessons of Ravensbrück remain alive, not as distant tragedies, but as urgent reminders of the world we must strive to build. A world where cruelty is confronted, where justice is pursued, and where the dignity of every human life is fiercely protected. The trials have ended. The survivors have grown older, and many have passed on. But their voices remain, their strength remains, and their message endures, that even in the darkest places, humanity can survive. And that as long as we remember Ravensbrück, we carry with us the resolve to prevent such darkness from ever rising again.